Good afternoon. We are here today, two distinguished economists who have written from a perspective of policy. The tradition of writing about policy by people who are connected very closely with policy is an old one in India. It goes back at least to the years soon after independence, where you had the Mahalanobis model, now more popularly known as Nehruvian economics, which pushed forward the idea of industrialize or perish, using the state as an instrument in that. That was, you had an alternative view at the time, which led to the work of Dandekar and Rath on poverty in India, which was much more grounded, less theoretical perhaps, but has survived over 70 years. And later you had equally critical and perhaps contentious debates between the welfareism of Amartya Sen and the kind of free trade economics of Jagdish Bhagwati. Underlying theme in all these kind of writing about policy has been a different concept of development, which... Okay. I said an underlying theme, and I was just looking at the various ways in which policymakers have looked at policy. And the underlying theme in that thinking has been that the concept of development has been quite different in some sense, and as well as the way to get there. So I thought, given the fact that one of you at least has been involved directly in government, as well as the other has been a very close observer of government and policy, perhaps we could begin by asking what exactly is the concept of development in this book, because you're writing about India's Development Odyssey. What is your concept of development in it?
Yeah, I think the question is, what is our concept of development more broadly? Yeah. First of all, I think authors should never overpromise or overclaim. This is not a theoretical book about development. This is not about development theory or some abstract notion of development. For example, development as freedom by Amartya Sen, or development as capabilities. So all of this, we deal with this, but there's no theory of development per se. In part, that's because our approach to this book, Devesh and I approach to this book, is that although we all have priors, we didn't want to embark on this journey with strong priors, and then look for the data to validate our priors. As we say, this is very much a book where the data drives the argument rather than the argument looking for corroborative data. But that being said, we do have an overarching framework of development, which is in fact why we wrote the book. Devesh is a political scientist who's done some excellent work on the Indian state, for example, amongst other things. I've worked on more economic growth and economic policy, and we came together precisely because we said development is much broader than just economic development or some narrow outcome or the other. For us, development is, especially for a country in 1947 that embarked on this really remarkable and difficult odyssey, our theory is development is about how India had to reconfigure the colonial state into a development state, so changing the state, how this hierarchical and ossified society had to be transformed, how the early visionaries had to build a sense of nationhood. Who is an Indian and what do we share? Building a nation. And number 4, of course, creating markets and economics. So a theory of development or a framework for development is building a state, nation, society, markets, and all this had to be done in the very unique journey path via universal franchise-based democratic politics from day one, unlike other countries where democracy came much later. So that's our framework for development, which we use in the book.
Yeah, that framework, if we can stay with the framework just for a minute before going on to what you read from the data that you have studied in great detail. It's a remarkably detailed data analysis, and I think even people who disagree with you will go back to the book repeatedly just because of the kind of depth and detail that is there. But when you're looking at, though you're looking at it in a very broad sense, the question that comes up is that you do have occasional things into concepts. And for instance, your idea of the Gandhi roles, concept of development, etc. Now this is new in the sense that it doesn't, not just because of something that's different, but because it doesn't fit into the common perception of Gandhi's concept of development being anti-development. So would you mind just telling us a little more about that as to, and whether you would have gone further with it? Because I think at some point, you're looking at a commonality between Rawls' difference principle, that is, looking at the condition of the worst off, and Gandhi's idea of the talisman, which does the same thing. But would you have considered going beyond that to develop a development theory if the book was more theoretical? Or would you still have stayed away from that?
No, we would not have gone further because we don't believe that's our comparative advantage. In that spirit in which you said, what we look at is the different type of inequalities in Indian society going further than poverty, and that unlike in the West where one usually thinks of inequality in terms of income, wealth, consumption, we wanted to look at how inequalities have fared across India's major social cleavages. And that we know is, of course, caste, region, religion, and gender. So we look at that in sort of detail to see how these have fared, and of course, the India's tribal populations. And we show that overall, empirically, in the past 7 decades, if you take Hindu upper caste as the criteria or as the yardstick, there is gradual convergence. It doesn't mean it has converged, but the trend from the OBCs and the Dalits. However, that is not the case in the case of India's Muslim population and the Adivasi or the tribal population of central India. So what we bring out is, as you said, our focus is on the empirical part, and where these concepts are sort of brought out, but we don't focus as much on the theoretical concepts per se.
So let's be a little bit controversial here, So it's very clear that, the Hindu and Frontline have a certain, let's say, affinity for a certain kind of perspective on the world. So when you mentioned Jagdish Bhagwati and Amartya Sen, and you're really pushing us in the direction of the Amartya Sen perspective on development, about human capability and inequality and so on. And Devesh touched upon how we look at the different kinds of inequality, not just along income lines and all of this. But going back to this fundamental, Bhagwati versus Sen kind of framework, just for those who may not be, just to clarify it, Amartya Sen, of course, and Bhagwati are India's 2 greatest economists. Amartya Sen very much believes that, economic development is about human capability, about, social justice, social welfare and so on. And Jagdish Bhagwati is kind of in the school where efficiency and growth should be emphasized, as it were. So we're pretty unapologetic in the book about saying, in this debate between Sen and Bhagwati, they were both wrong. Because in India, economic growth changed everything about India. So we're kind of fairly unapologetic about saying is that even if you want human capability, even if you want to, even if you want to address the Gandhi-Rawls transformation, economic growth was actually everything. So let me just give you two instances where we think, both of them were inadequate. We use the word Gandhi-Rawls transformation because both Gandhi and Rawls wanted to emphasize the poorest in society, which we took as poverty, how well we do under poverty. It turns out that in the first 30 years under socialism, poverty was high and stagnant at about 60%. And all the reductions, dramatic reductions in poverty happened between 1980 and 2012 in the period of rapid economic growth. Now come to human capability, the Amartya Sen kind of obsession, justifiable obsession. We show, for example, in the first 30 years, educational attainment was abysmal in India. It improved over time for many reasons, but one of them was because economic growth provided the resources for the state to spend more on education, and economic growth also led parents to demand more education for their children, and if they could not obtain it from the public system, they went to private schools. So really, even human capability was transformed by economic growth. So these are just two examples of, where we say the two great men were both inadequate.
Yeah. But when you look at, would you like to add to that? But when you look at the same argument as about the first 30 years, and I think you have an interesting classification because you look at the 80s as a separate era, which is a break from the normal tradition which takes the entire period till 91. But when you look at that period, you get the impression sometimes that the first 30 years did not have any impact on the other years. So is there a possibility that you're underestimating whatever groundwork was done during those 30 years?
I would disagree with that. I think we make it very clear that one of the most fundamental achievements of the first 30 years was how India achieved nation building without mass violence. I think we tend to forget in human history just how much state and nation building, it doesn't matter which country you look at, how much bloodshed accompanies state and nation building. If you look at the US Civil War, 2% of the population is killed. If you apply that to India, that would be 30 million people. The People's Republic of China was formed around the same time that India became independent. In the next quarter century, 40 to 50 million people were killed in China. And what we argue was that the universal franchise was a key instrument of sort of nation building. India did not use the idea of a single religion or single state as was done in much of the West and other parts of the world. Instead, it chose a unique and distinctive path. And then it chose certain policies which we argue had negative consequences. For instance, we show just how much India bled red ink on state-owned enterprises, just how expensive it was, the very high opportunity cost. So there's always this mixed picture because look around the world. Look at other large systems. The Soviet Union, it broke apart. Yugoslavia, it broke apart. Our neighbor, Pakistan, it broke apart. Sudan, it broke apart. Large countries, we should recognize how hard it is to maintain nation building and state building. And that, I think, was a phenomenal achievement.
So just to add to what Devesh said, among the many early choices that were made, nation building, not basing the nation on a single religion or ethnicity or so on. But the other very unusual choice that India made, which people don't realize, it comes across in a comparative context, is this affirmative action for hitherto disadvantaged minorities. No country actually did that anywhere in the world. And that's important to note. So for example, the whole reservations, both in political representation and in education, which India initially granted for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, which of course have increased over time. If you look around the world, for example, South Africa, it also gave affirmative action, but for its majority. Similarly, Malaysia did it for the Bhumiputra strategy, did it for its majority. Sri Lanka favored the Sinhala-speaking Buddhist. Similarly, Pakistan. So India not only was not based on any one language, religion, etc., but also it did favor disadvantaged minorities in a way that was unique around the world. Of course, we can talk about how it evolved over time, whether it's right or wrong, but that choice at that time was pretty historic, yeah? So when you say, coming to the second part of your question, when you say, nothing carries over, I think maybe it's a deficiency of the book, but I do think, because we end the book actually by saying that these great achievements of the early years, we risk squandering today, and that would be fatal for India as a country and democracy. And sorry, one last point, which Devesh always emphasizes, is that part of democracy is not just about elections, it's about a democratic sensibility, which is accommodation, compromise, inclusion, and so on. So that sensibility we are at risk of losing, and that was one of the great achievements of that era.
But as you just clarified, it's the whole process of having democracy before development. It gave us benefits in terms of a nation, in terms of the non-economic aspects. But do you think that you paid an economic price for that?
Yes, I think we should be very clear-eyed that the democracy doesn't come without costs. And we emphasize one in the early years. So basically India's largely failure at sort of land reform. No democracy has undertaken land reform successfully, period. Land reform has occurred under revolutionary regimes. It's occurred by authoritarian regimes. Land reform occurred in Japan and Korea because of US occupation forces, which imposed a fiat. Democracies it is very, very hard. And we know that in the early decades, land was a state subject. The Congress was beholden to local landed elites. And so, other than the zamindari system, by and large, we know that the outcomes were meager. And that's a price you paid, because the democracies cannot do radical reforms. By nature, you will get more gradual reforms. A second price that we pay, and which we argue increasingly paying, is corruption. We know you cannot have, there's no democracy without elections. There are no elections without money. And we now have more competitive elections, more frequent elections. The average time between elections was 5 years in the 50s and 60s. Now it's 1.2 years. You pay a price in terms of the horizons politicians have. They're unwilling to undertake reforms where the payoff is over several years, like administrative reforms. And we know that a huge story behind corruption is the money needed to fight elections. So these are real costs, and we should not be shy about acknowledging.
So another, because by the way, the metaphor we use for democracy, for giving and taking, we say, there's a famous line in that Hindi movie, liquid oxygen, right? Liquid is a jeene nahi deta, oxygen is a marne nahi deta. So, the whole democracy is giving and taking. The one other big cost or manifestation is what we call the Kamadhenu fiscal state. If you look at the government deficit in India since 1991, it is the highest amongst comparable emerging market countries, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, China, whatever, all these countries, India has had the highest fiscal deficit. And this came as a surprise to us. Almost 10% of GDP every year. Now, why did it happen? Our argument in the book is that the Indian state was like Kamadhenu, the bovine goddess of mythology, generously, over-generously, indiscriminately giving to all manner of, vested interests in India. So the beauty about Indian democracy is not that, the state and are captured by, particular interests. That may be true too. But that the beauty of democracy is that almost everyone has the claim to the state. And so if you look at the tax side, vastly undertaxed, every group is exempt from taxation. And on the subsidy side, almost every group is favored by the central government, state governments, and local governments. So we have a situation where all the clamor is accommodated by India's precocious democracy, and we've ended up with a fiscal state that's very, very vulnerable. The big manifestation of this is that how much of our budget we spend on interest as opposed to, which crowds out spending on development expenditure and defense expenditure and so on. So the Indian Kamadhenu fiscal state is very much also one of the downsides of India's precocious democracy.
Now, the coming of democracy before development, you just referred to it as precocious, but you use the term precocious to refer to other patterns that have emerged in India as well. So first, if you could talk about what you mean by precocious very precisely, and what are the other patterns, and are they related to the choice of democracy, or did they occur independently?
So should I take the economic one? Yeah. So we use the term precocious to mean, unusual or irregular sequencing, whether it be politics, economics, or policy choices, and where the irregularness or the unusualness is in comparison to other countries. So we have a benchmark because we have a very comparative perspective in the book. Devesh will speak about the democracy before development. The economic manifestation, of course, we all know, which is most successful countries go from doing agriculture, then they do manufacturing, and then they do services. That's the normal sequence of successful development, especially East Asia most famously, but also Western Europe. India has gone from, agriculture, very little formal manufacturing, and a lot of IT services very prematurely, as it were. No country as poor as India has any business doing so much software, et cetera, et cetera. But now there is just be very briefly, there's an international dimension to this precociousness, which is that we export our high-skilled talent through emigration, right? And we shortchange because we did not do manufacturing enough. We did not provide enough formal sector jobs for tens and hundreds of millions of the Indian labor force. So there was a cost to this economic precociousness, not doing labor-intensive manufacturing, which means not providing employment opportunities for women because labor-intensive manufacturing is female labor-intensive. So that shortchanging in terms of not providing enough employment opportunities is one of the downsides of the economic precociousness that we had.
So I think there were two other elements of this precociousness. One, we tried to build a welfare state without first laying a strong foundation of public goods. Almost everywhere else, by public goods we mean primary education, public health, which are roads, public infrastructure. Almost all developed countries, if you see in the path, welfare comes much later in the economic development story. You first lay a foundation of public goods. And even today, we have a weak foundation of public goods, and we continue to add more and more welfare without strengthening that base. Now, in terms of the political choice, the precociousness, we show how much India was an outlier at the extreme low levels of income and education, and at which it gave universal franchise. And how much it was an outlier in that it gave both men and women franchise at the same time. In most countries, there's a big gap between men and women. And remember, at the time of independence, India was a massively patriarchal society. Not that it is not so now, but it was much more so then. And so these were very unusual choices made at that time. And then, of course, the book examines the consequences of those choices.
So just one last point. You did ask whether, some of the other precociousness was due to democracy. I just will say, we'll just give one example. So in the first 30 years, what you call the socialist era, Nehruvian economics, some of the things we did because most countries around the world were doing, like planning, for example, building up a public sector, shutting ourselves off from foreign competition. But we did something very unusual which no other country did, that when countries shut themselves off from foreign competition, they did that in order to favor domestic entrepreneurship, give them some space. That's why you protect. But we turned around and stifled and stymied the domestic private sector with all kinds of controls and licenses. Now, that choice of actually, crushing the domestic private sector, which actually had a major impact in that period and thereafter, had actually very little to do with democracy. It was just a kind of ideological choice, a contingent choice, because we felt that, we didn't want capital to become too big. So that choice was not due to democracy. But then, as Devesh said, the land reform perhaps was because, of democracy and how the Congress party was set up.
But when you talk about stopping the private sector, the impression we get, probably I'm misreading the book, but the impression you get is it's because it was an inward-looking policy, that we're looking inwards. But now we have, since 1991, been fairly outward-looking, but our manufacturing hasn't recovered. It's still growing very, very slowly. So how much of a weightage would you give to the policy makers then, or are there more structural or more serious problems involved?
Yeah, so I think that, so one of the puzzles we pose in the book is the following, that after 1991, India grew very rapidly. Our growth rate was amongst the top 5 in the world, right? Second, what people don't recognize enough is that was a period where our trade also grew very rapidly, amongst the highest in the world. So just to give one statistic which people might not fully recognize, between 1995 and about 2010, for about 25 years, or 25 years, India's manufacturing growth, not services, which we did, which everyone knows, manufacturing growth was the 3rd highest in the world, right? However, and this comes to your question, that manufacturing growth was not labor-intensive manufacturing growth. So we devote a whole chapter to asking why that's the case. Because as you rightly said, not only did we grow, but we also abandoned many of those policies that had stymied the private sector. And this is a very complicated answer that we give a fivefold. I think, let me just mention one. One is that we still have a highly over-regulated state in India, and it impacts on size. Because to be competitive in manufacturing, you have to have very big plants, especially today. If you want to compete against China, you have to have factories that employ 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people. And something about our politics and our regulatory environment has not allowed really firms to become very big. And we call that midgets making widgets. Now, the one exception. The good news is that in Tamil Nadu in the last 4 or 5 years, we actually have factories that are now employing enough people that can make us competitive in the rest of the world. This is Tamil pride. I'm stoking Tamil pride here, but that's one of the reasons. But we give other explanations. In fact, there's one very important explanation which I want Devesh to.
So, the usual things about why manufacturing continues to struggle is that we didn't do reforms in factor markets, land, labor, and electricity. We show that manufacturing in India today, because of the massive subsidies to farmers and households, continues to pay twice the world average prices. So you've already stymied it. But much of the work on sort of labor-related issues, it focuses on labor regulations, etc. We point to something else, which is the severe distortions due to the nature of government labor markets. As some of you know, most government employees are in what is now called Group C. There was a Group D earlier, but the vast bulk. Group C workers are paid 4-5 times as much of what, with their skills, you would get in the private sector. It sets an upward push on wages because, as we know, tens of millions of young Indians take government exam after exam trying to get into a government, and they spend some of the best years of their lives, and they waste away, even though the probability that a young person will get a government job is less than 1%. There just aren't jobs, there will never be jobs. Anyone who thinks otherwise, it's complete delusion. But what that does is that I would rather win that lottery of getting a government job, but I will not work in a manufacturing enterprise where, of course, for those skills, your wages will be much lower. So there's a severe distortion because of the nature of the government labor market. That's something I think that's fairly new that we point out.
I know you looked at this whole thing of a higher price, but I could just take a contrarian, just for argument, that in your book you do point out that there has been state investments that have paid off, like in the IITs and in other similar levels. Now, the question is that these people who took those, the benefits of the IIT, it's one thing for the state to invest, but you also need the students or people who can send their children to IITs. That was created by the government jobs in some sense. The entire trade union movement created the high-wage workers who were able to send their children to these things and create our technical manpower. So would you discount that process, or would you think it would have happened anyway?
The single biggest contribution that many of our early IITs made is to the economy of the United States, not to India. Let's be very clear. So, as some of you know, MIT was the partner for creating IIT Kanpur. 10 years after MIT was involved in IIT Kanpur, and MIT was involved in 2 Indian institutions for engineering education, BITS Pilani, the private one, and IIT Kanpur. They did a review 10 years after, and they found that IIT Kanpur's education standards were absolutely world-class. And they had a nice line. They said, it is said, when a student first enters the gates of IIT Kanpur, his soul already ascends to the United States. BITS Pilani, they said, has done well, but not the way IIT Kanpur has. But far more of BITS Pilani's graduates stayed behind in India and built Indian institutions. So they posed the question, where did we succeed more? For the United States, IIT Kanpur was much bigger success. But for India, and look at the impact of IIT Kanpur on Kanpur. It's completely negligible. Right? Look at the impact of IIT Kanpur in the US. So I think the puzzle we have is not that India should not have invested, but that, for instance, it never asked the question that if the public exchequer is spending so much in training you Fine, if you leave the country, as in a democracy, you should have that right. I mean, I went to one of these. But should you need to repay the public exchequer back? So there was no quid pro quo. And that has been a very unfortunate thing.
I think just to add to one thing, there's a kind of underbelly to this IIT, which is different, which is that, these are all great institutes of higher education. And as Devesh was saying, they ascend to the US before they descend to India, as it were. But all that would have been partly compensated had these become centers of world-class research as well. So they were not really research centers either, which then benefited the rest of the Indian economy. They just became places where you got the best talent, you can change their soul and their accent maybe, and ship them off to the United States.
No, well, this is not in your book, but just to continue the conversation, and I think I just like your view on this. Did that occur because you did have a research tradition in science in India, and the Institute of Science, you had C.V. Raman, and even in Calcutta you had J.C. Bose, etc. But did this occur because you shifted from science to technology? You shifted the focus of your attention from science to technology? Was that a source of the problem?
I mean, look, this is a longer conversation, but basically starting from the late 50s, essentially we began to destroy our universities. I mean, if you read the commission of report, I mean, we read about 3,000 of these reports on sort of BHU or on the central universities. So by the 60s, 70s, the universities, good universities of North India, Patna, BHU, Lucknow University, all of them got completely undermined by student politics, political interference. Then 70s onwards, the great universities of West Bengal, Maharashtra, Bombay University is a shadow of what it used to be. MS University, Baroda. So in part, science education was a lot in the universities. The fact that the IITs provided a very good education, exams are held on time, the basics of what a university ought to do, is the failure of the universities as much as the success of the IITs that contributes to the shift.
So there is a basis for people moving out, as you said, that people start thinking out. Now, if there's a continuous flow of talent, in fact, you list that as one of your precociousness, case of precociousness, where you're exporting talent rather. Now, if there's a continuous flow of talent, can you be sure money won't follow through?
So sorry?
Money won't flow out, because if you have IIT people setting up institutions here, they might also start investing abroad. And now we are seeing, I think last year, your FDIs from India almost match the FDIs into India.
I think that's less of I mean, we know there is a flow of capital outside India, et cetera, that millionaires are sort of leaving India. They're also leaving China, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a variety of reasons. No, I think, I mean, it's a larger story of how India thinks about talent. And in the way that returning, remember, from the 30s to the very idea of IIT, if you want to know how it came about, when at the time of independence, we began to think about engineering and technology education, the model was going to be Imperial College in sort of London, because of course we were heavily influenced by sort of British engineering. It so happened that 2 Gujaratis had been sent to study engineering in MIT in the 1930s. They had come back and they pointed out that the model of engineering should be MIT. They were influential in shaping and reshaping the model. And then, of course, US aid and so on and so forth. Now, the sad part was not that we build the IITs. The sad part was how we destroyed and undermined the existing universities that had been built up in the first half of the 20th century, and public universities got so politicized. I mean, in our work, I think no political party genuinely cares or understands about higher education other than the physical part.
So just, there were two other dimensions to, I think we should, when we talk about emigration of people, we should not just, focus on the emigration of talent, because we also have large-scale outflows of relatively unskilled labor as well. And of course, the one remarkable success story in India is, as I say, there's one state in the world, one geography in the world, for which there's no international counterpart, which is a geography that does no agriculture, that does no manufacturing, that does no services, and yet is a shining development success, which is Kerala. Because Kerala has basically, sent all the, labor abroad, and which is something which needs to be mentioned. For this going abroad, remittances come back, remittances come back, and that's contributed to Kerala's success as well.
Yeah, of course, the Kerala remittances is linked to the story that the countries they are migrating to, at least in the first phase, don't allow them to become citizens there. So that's also part of the story. We need to go to the audience, but I can't resist one last question. One of the critical things that you bring out in your book, which favors a free market by and large, is that you also point out, you spend a lot of spirit, I would say, more than time, pointing out the extent to which the policy that emerged in the 50s was because of the conditions of the time, the success of the Soviet Union and the various elements. So if I were to use that in the current situation, how much of our policies today are based on the mood of the time? How much of our free market kind of policies that we have, or liberalization, is to the mood of the time? Or can we see a book 10, 20 years from now saying, that was wrong, but it went with the mood of the time?
So, yeah. Huh? Yeah. So I think, as you said, in the 50s, we see the tragedy, or one of the maybe the shortcomings, is that we did in the 50s what many countries did. But remember, not all countries in the 50s did what we looked at. For example, famously, the East Asians followed a very different model. And maybe part of the problem is that our leaders' gaze was always looking westward and to Russia and to China, and not enough on this. I think there's also no doubt that after 91, that the turn to markets, as it were, in India, was reflected the zeitgeist of the time. Of course, we had a crisis which triggered it, but there was an underlying feeling that, especially when China, remember that for a long time, when Indians were told about the East Asian success, we always said somewhat condescendingly, but these are all small countries, right? We are a big country, it doesn't apply to us. But when China decisively turned towards markets and so on, and the world shifted as well, and I think we also shifted in line. I think it's also true that after the global financial crisis and so on, India has also returned to protectionism since about 2017-18, and also turned to industrial policy, promoting national champions and so on. So, and the rest of the world also, this is consistent with what's happening in the rest of the world as well. Of course, there are differences. Most famously, for example, when we promote national champions, we think that's what happened in Korea, but our national champions are, in the Korean case, when they promoted the national champions, they were told, you will get favors from the state, but you will be subject to the discipline of becoming competitive and having to export. India's national champions, the 2As, for example, they operate mostly in, non-regulated, non-traded sectors, where it's not obvious that they are doing the counterpart. They're getting the favors, but are they doing the counterpart being, globally competitive is an open question.
I think one of the, all countries, especially development, are shaped by ideas. And of course, you look at ideas of which countries are successful, which are not, as you should. But I think, as Arvind said, our gaze has always been because our elites are much more educated in the West, so your gaze is naturally there. Much less so in the East. Very few of our elites know Japanese or Korean or Chinese.
Or Taiwanese.
And the fact that how little understanding we have of China, which is by far the most outstanding development success in so many different ways, because hardly anyone speaks Chinese, we don't ever read their material, and whenever we see it being successful, we are dismissed, well, they are a communist country, if only we were authoritarian we could do, which is simply not the case. So I think we don't do the hard work of understanding all the hard work that it takes to achieve real success, as was the case with East Asia.
We have time for just 3 questions from the audience. So you could, if you can get the mic across.
Hello. Over at the top, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. So you had mentioned about us leapfrogging from agriculture to services, kind of bypassing manufacturing. But I just want to ask, in this scenario where technology is kind of exploding, is it possible for such kind of a large-scale employment in manufacturing possible? And do you see some kind of a universal basic income as kind of a solution for that? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. If you can have 3 questions and get a common answer.
Yeah, the second question, I think they want all the 3 questions together so that they can answer.
Check. Sir, here, sir. Straight.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. First of all, before I could ask my question, I teach economics. I've been reading the economic survey for the last 10 years. The economic surveys which Mr. Arvind Subramanian wrote was the best ones, and your successes weren't that impressive. And I wanted to compliment that. And my question is, this is a just simple question, sir. I just want both the panelists to answer. What are all the 3 things which hampers the development of India from now to the next 25 years? And what 3 policy changes? So keep it simple, sir. No need to elaborate. I know it's a large answer, but keep it short and just give it in a pointers. 3 things which hampers, 3 policy changes needed.
Okay,
Quite like that, actually. Yeah, one more. One more.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sir, I'm Subramanian. My question is relating to freebies. You know that all the political parties are offering freebies to the underprivileged communities of our country. But my question is whether these freebies have been translated into, or how much part of it has been translated into development and the growth of our country. This is my question, sir.
Okay, I think.
There's a lady there, yeah. There's a lady.
Yeah.
Last question
There's
for
a
the lady there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Here.
No, here.
Yeah, the lady is what they're pointing out to, yeah. Do you want to just check your mic once?
Hello. Yeah. Good evening, all. So you mentioned about the fiscal deficit being at 10% for India, and this is a serious concern. So what are the measures would you recommend now that we are staring at a concerning figure? Because this is a similar theme that played out in US politics as well, where the fiscal deficit is roofing at seriously concerning figures. So would you recommend something like austerity measures? But again, that comes with the downside of how Europe is looking in terms of the global development. So that would be great if you can add your insights.
Thank you.
So do you take the do no harm question? I'll do that, and you do the do no harm. Okay. The first question, all great questions, by the way. The first question, so the question is the manufacturing model valid going forward? Because, as he rightly says, robots, for example, will actually even make labor-intensive manufacturing, even less labor-intensive manufacturing? So it's a great question. The answer to that is in the simple numbers. China today accounts for about 50% of the global exports in low-skill goods. That is apparel, textiles, footwear, toys, electronics, and so on. 50%. Our share is 3%. So our 3% will never become even 25%. But if the 3% becomes even 12, 13, 14%, and even accounting for that the 12%, 15% will not provide enough jobs as in the past, you will still get a lot of employment, which is worth having. So we should not give up on unskilled manufacturing, because China's 50 has to go down, and ours 3, if it can go up, there will still be a lot of jobs. On the fiscal deficit question, I think in some ways it's related to the other question as well. There is no doubt that we are vulnerable from this fiscal situation, and we are able to sustain it because we are a reasonably rapidly growing economy. So the debt that we have seems to be sustainable, but if the growth slows down, we need to. So I think absolutely we need to, start slowly. Nothing in India can be done radically. We don't need any hard austerity measures, but both at the center and at the states, there should be a slow reduction in the deficit, especially in all these, welfare type cash transfer schemes, which kind of up to a point they're good, but beyond a point, I think they do, compromise our fiscal situation in a way that could prove to be dangerous in the future.
So, we are usually always asked for some recommendations. What should India do? Before we wrote this book, we wrote a slim book on what should India do. It was 100 pages, and we tore it up. When we wrote this book, as I said, we read about 3,000 plus official government reports, and it's remarkable actually how self-reflective the Indian state has been, even occasionally self-flagellating, but very rarely self-correcting. Nothing that we have to say has not been said. You should improve your education, you should reduce corruption. All of us know this. The last chapter of a 750-page book is about 5 pages, looking in the future, and we give just one recommendation, which is a sort of a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. I think we don't recognize how fragile nation and states can be. Look at the Soviet Union, the superpower of the world. Within a year, it had gone. And so we point out that, look, we use the example of air pollution in Delhi. For 40 years, that problem has gone on, massively detrimental to the health of children, adults. Everyone knows that. And India's power elite lives in Delhi and has been unable to address the very problem which even they can't escape. So we use that to say that, look, many of the challenges we face, whether on agriculture or manufacturing or electricity or education, many of these require a strong cooperative federalism where the center alone cannot solve them, the states alone can't solve them. You need a healthy compromise, a healthy way of thinking together of these systems. You also need, what we point out, that many of the public goods challenges, whether it's learning, poor learning outcomes, or the problem of garbage or solid waste management, it requires much, these are goods that are co-produced between the state and society. And so it is not a thing where it can be a complete top-down thing. If you don't have the spirit of compromise or working together, it doesn't matter what the challenge is, you will find it very hard to address it.
So just to add one last thing is that I think fundamentally we need more trust between the center and the states. And that is, at the heart of cooperative federalism, because all our challenges. And one of the dangers we risk now in the current environment is over-centralization, over whatever, which threatens this, deep, deep sense of trust, which is absolutely critical to anything we need to do going forward.
Thank you very much, Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian. Thank you.